In this video, we will be covering some of the strangest and darkest mysteries that range from unsolved murders, missing people's cases, serial killers, archaeological, historical, and geographical mysteries. As always, grab a drink. My choice today is chai tea, or just chai, I guess, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries iceberg. And just quickly before you begin, if you like the look of these mugs, they are all official, unique designs for Connor's Curiosities, available in the shop in the link down below. You can kill two birds with one stone, you get some awesome looking merch, and you support the channel at the same time. We've also got hats, as you can see sitting on top of my head, and we have also got jumpers with some very cool designs on. The front as well also has a, little logo on. But yeah, we have all sorts on the website. So if you want to support the channel, head over to the link in the description, and the first 6 people who order will get a handwritten letter from yours truly. But for now, let's get back into the iceberg. The Trofimov Beheadings is an insane but also incredibly brutal and violent case that took place in 2012 in Kharkiv in Ukraine. And it was on a day, the 15th of December, when a judge called Volodymyr Trofimov, and his wife and his son and his son's girlfriend were all found in the family home dead with their heads cut off. And these heads weren't found at the scene and were actually never found or recovered. There were also some valuables that were stolen from the home. And I think more importantly, all of this entire event, these attacks, these killings, these beheadings, all took place on a day called Judge's Day in Ukraine, which certainly seems like it was a, planned attack. It was trying to perhaps send a message like, judges all up and down the country, better go along with whoever did this, otherwise the same thing could happen to you. Or it was a specific targeted message for Volodymyr based on some judgment he had made, some ruling he had decided on. And there were a few interesting things about this case. The first thing was that the house, the apartment that the family was in, it didn't show any signs of breaking and entering, which means that either whoever broke into it was, incredibly skilled with picklocking, although that's normally the signs that the investigators look for, whether the locks have been picked or not, or whoever killed them, whoever opened the doors knew the family personally. So they might have just rocked up and said, hey, I brought over some wine, let me in. And then when the family did open the doors, the killers came in. Or another theory was that whoever did the killings was perhaps posed as a law enforcement officer or some other official position, and they said perhaps that they needed to speak to the family about a case, which explains why the family let them in and there was no sign of breaking and entering. So a few different theories there. They also stole, as I said, some valuables from the home, which included some rare coins, some military medals, a few random artifacts, because Volodymyr seemed to be, somewhat of an amateur collector. And for this crime scene, there was really very little evidence for the investigators to go off. They didn't find any, usable DNA evidence. The killers probably wore gloves, so there was no fingerprints anywhere. And as I said, the heads themselves were taken from the scene and never recovered, which just further limited the amount of evidence that they could gather. And so that's kind of where the case ended up, ending. It seems very likely to me that either the family knew whoever they opened the door for, or they were disguised in some other official position. And it seems very, very likely that this was a targeted attack on a, Ukrainian judge on Judge's Day, and perhaps was done by some sort of corrupt, organized crime gang or something. But as I said, that's where the case ended, and it still remains unsolved, sadly, to this day. Utsuro-Bune. Another alien entry. One, in fact, which we already covered in a previous iceberg, that being obviously the alien iceberg. As always, go and check that out if you like aliens. But this Utsuro-Bune was a strange craft that washed up on the east coast of Japan in 1803, so a very long time ago. But according to the tales of this, it washed up ashore along with a strange woman who couldn't speak the local language, couldn't speak Japanese, but she seemed to have her own language, her own dialect that the locals couldn't understand. So they were just talking at like cross purposes with one another. But she washed up ashore with this strange craft, this strange vessel, and she was also very strange. And the vessel was apparently made out of metal and wood and had these either glass or crystal windows or panels on. And it was covered in writing, but not Japanese writing. Like, it seemed to be in a strange script, a strange language, and they didn't know what it was. They couldn't read it or understand it. And when these locals came up to her, they were trying to help her. They, approached her. She was apparently mental. She went hyper. She went frantic. She was super possessive of this box that she had with her, and she wouldn't let anyone touch it or go near it. And eventually she didn't accept the help from the locals. They couldn't understand her. As I said, she was just frantic. So eventually, I guess they just kind of got bored of her and were like, yep, back into the ocean you go. And they put her back into the vessel. They pushed her out into the ocean, and she just floated away and was never seen again. Now, there are a few theories about this case, about this encounter. One saying that she was human and she was perhaps a princess of a nearby, area or nearby country. Perhaps she was from Korea or China maybe, and she just, washed up on the island of Japan. Which, if the Japanese people at the time didn't, understand these other languages, perhaps they saw this Korean script, they couldn't understand it, she was speaking Korean, as I think especially back in the 1800s, not that I was around back then, but it makes sense that everything would be more disconnected. You might get, villagers or locals that have never even heard of Korea, and especially have never seen, the Korean script or the language. And so it was theorized that perhaps she was a princess from some neighboring land, and that she had cheated on her prince or king or whatever with a commoner, and this had completely offended her entire family, brought massive dishonor to her father, etc. And so as punishment, they killed the commoner, they chopped off his head, put it in the box to force her to keep it and look at it. And because she was royal, because she was a princess, I guess they didn't want to kill her, but they just put her in a little, vessel, a little boat, pushed her out to sea, got her away from the kingdom or whatever, and so she then, floated down to Japan. That's why perhaps she was so defensive of this box, because it contained the head of her, lover. And so that is one theory about what this case was. And another, quite predictably, was that she was in fact an alien, and she was in this craft. Perhaps she had floated here, flown to Earth, crash landed in the ocean, and then was bopping around, finally landed in Japan in this strange alien craft with alien text on. And that is the more or less other theory. I do personally kind of like both theories. The idea of her being, some sort of alien in a strange, weird little craft with a little box in. Maybe she was a shapeshifter, so she looked a little bit human. That sort of stuff, always interests me a little bit. But also, if she was really a princess from a distant land, that is also insanely fascinating. Exactly what kingdom did she come from? We don't really know. What language did she actually speak? How were they able to craft, these crystal or glass kind of windows on the side of this vessel? It all seems very, very cool, no matter which theory you ascribe to. The Volcanic Winter of 536. So this is a bit of a simple one, so I won't spend too long on it. But as you can imagine, 536 is or was a long time ago. And this particular year was the year of a volcanic winter recorded in history, both in terms of traditional written or spoken history. These were accounts from around the time, and also from scientific history, in that we're able to examine ice cores and soil and rock analysis sort of thing. And this period was described as having a sun without brightness, where all over Europe, crops just failed, temperatures dropped substantially, the sun's light was like weaker and dimmer than usual, and even was described in some accounts as being blue. And we think overall this was very likely caused by like a large volcanic eruption, which happened probably sometime around like 535 to 536. And after this, just as everything, in Europe, around the world was slowly recovering, then another one went off at around 539. And then another one, a big one, in 547. And these all happening, within a relatively short period of one another. They led to a time called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which was from around 536 to 660 AD. And that's the basic breakdown of the case. So it must have been an insanely wild time, especially back then when survival itself was, not like a given. If crops failed one year, it could very well mean the end of your entire family, of your entire village or tribe or whatever. And for this time period, it must have been one of the worst time periods in all of history. Just darkness, cold temperatures, crops failing everywhere, people starving, but just exactly what caused it, we're not entirely sure. As I said, the evidence is there for volcanic eruptions, but firstly, we're not super sure if some of them were volcanoes or some of them were like meteorite strikes. We're also not entirely sure where the volcanoes were, whether they were in Europe themselves or somewhere in Asia or perhaps somewhere in America like California. But what we do know, as I said, it must have been one hell of a time. Water elephants is one of these kind of cryptid, kind of extinct creature mysteries, similar to some that we've already covered in this iceberg. But this is just sightings of these strange, I guess, elephant-like creatures or animals, spotted mostly around Africa, mostly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And honestly, they look a little cute in my eyes. Like, I mean, you're telling me you wouldn't want to take one of these little creatures home, maybe give it a bath in the bathtub with its little blubber and its stupid anteater-like snout. Okay, maybe it's just me. But anyway, the first recorded sighting of one of these is from a man named Le Petit, or in English, the Small, who was a French explorer in 1907, who reported seeing these 2 to 2.5 meter tall elephant-like, but notably not elephant, creatures. He said for sure he knew what an elephant looked like, and these were kind of reminiscent of elephants, but they definitely weren't elephants. He apparently, while he was there, asked the locals about this, who are the Taki people, and they said these creatures were called, and I'm gonna absolutely butcher this pronunciation, but they were called the Ngoko na Maiji, which again, sorry for the pronunciation if it's off, which it most likely is, but this translated to, in the local language, water elephant. And they apparently told Le Petit that these were these incredibly rare animals that spent all day in the water and only came out to land during the nighttime. So yeah, a very strange case with some very strange creatures. They may be some strange kind of version of a Merytherium, who themselves were thought to have gone extinct millions of years ago, like around 20 to 30 million years ago. But some of their relatives may have survived to this day. They might be descendants of these creatures. And if they're as elusive as the local people say, they might be living, hidden away in the waters of Africa, unseen to modern eyes and to modern knowledge. Wayne Greavette was the name of a man who died horribly, tragically, after someone sent a bomb to his family home around Christmas time in 1996. And this bomb, strangely enough, was disguised as a flashlight, which when he turned it on, well, I'm sure you can imagine what happened then. His son, Justin, earlier in the day had, gone out into town to get some gas, and when he went out, he saw this package in the family mailbox. So he took the package with him, put it in his car, went to town, got some gas, came home, left the package kind of on the side, and when his father Wayne got home, he gave the father this package. So it's around, Christmas time, you get a package like this in the mail. As you do, you probably open it straight away. It might be a gift, might be a present or something. And when they unwrapped this package, it was kind of boxed up in an old wine box. And what they found was this torch, basically, a flashlight stuffed with these flyers as like a form of packing. And they also found inside a letter addressed to Wayne. The flashlight itself was kind of like one of those fat flashlights. It was big, chunky, it had like a big handle on it. And the letter that was addressed to Wayne was typed out, not handwritten, but it was typed out on what seemed to be some sort of a old typewriter. And the letter for, a package including a bomb was not at all threatening. It was quite cordial, quite polite, and seemed to be aimed at Wayne accepting a business proposition, which I will read it out here so you can fully understand it. But it read, Mr. Wayne Greavette. Dear Sir, my partners and I are opening a new business sometime early in the new year called Acton Home Products, and would be very interested on having you give us a price on rebuilding some equipment. You did some work for a company that I was with a few years ago, and although you won't remember me, Lisa and your delivery man Joe most likely will. We don't plan on doing anything until after the new year, but would be most anxious to proceed at that time. We have no staff or office in place just yet, but you can reach us by mail at our new address below. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you sometime early in the new year. Sincerely, William J. French. Acton Home Products, RR number 1, unit number 6, and then it just goes on with the rest of his return address. And then at the bottom, it says, P.S. Didn't realize you had moved. Had some trouble finding you. Have a Merry Christmas, and may you never have to buy another flashlight. Which, as you can imagine, when investigators, investigated everything, including this letter, they found that the named company didn't exist, the return address for the company didn't exist, and they couldn't find anyone by the name of William J. French. And so this entire sweet talking to Wayne, this business proposal, these good wishes within the letter, they seemed to be just aimed at making Wayne let his guard down in order to trick him to turning on this flashlight. And as you may have already spotted at the bottom of the message, have a Merry Christmas, may you never have to buy another flashlight, because Wayne will be dead. So very dark, that little cheeky message at the bottom. But on that fateful day, Justin, Wayne's son, initially tried to turn on the flashlight himself. So he tried turning it on. Nothing really happened. He thought it's probably out of batteries or something. He tried opening the case to check on the batteries, but he said it felt almost like the case was like glued shut or something, which made sense if there was a bomb inside and the guy who made the bomb didn't want it tampered with or checked on or disabled or something. And so Justin was a bit, confused, a bit weird. He handed the flashlight to his father, and Wayne, who was sitting down on the family couch at that time, kind of reading the letter, he put the letter aside, he tried to turn on the flashlight, and it just completely exploded, almost instantly killing him. As he had the flashlight really close to his body. There were other family members, including Justin, nearby, but thankfully none of them were seriously injured. And the bomb itself was made from a material called superfrac, which is like this type of mining explosive that is somewhat easy to purchase. They won't sell it to you in the local Walmart or anything, but it was common enough where the investigators kind of had trouble tracking down where it might have come from or who might have purchased it. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the killer included within the bomb dozens of these roofing nails, which acted as shrapnel when the bomb went off, making the explosion even more deadly. And honestly, with this case, police had no real idea who would have done this to Henry, who might have done it to him, whether it was targeted at just him or his entire family, or whether it was a random attack. And the random attack angle for me doesn't seem too likely because, they used Wayne's name, they used some of his ex-employees, they found his address even though he had moved. Like, it seemed very likely targeted at Wayne. But Wayne didn't really have any massive enemies. The main, enemy, I guess, was his ex-boss, who a few years ago had a minor falling out with him, but it wasn't anything absolutely crazy. These sorts of falling out and fights seem to happen all the time, and it's not necessarily something bad enough that they would make a bomb and send it to your house with this vindictive weird message in. So that was a bit strange. It was also rumored, not proven, but rumored that Wayne was kind of, into the devil's lettuce, the old Satan's broccoli, and so maybe he had some debts in that, area, and maybe he wouldn't pay the debts, so it ended up being settled with, sending a message or revenge. And there was also, with his ex-boss, also some rumors that he was kind of rude to some of his ex-employees. This boss ended up firing Wayne's wife from the company, and so that's where their, skiff kind of went. But as I said, was it bad enough that he would take out a targeted hit like this, or in fact make the bomb himself? That is a little hard to say. And the letter itself, with some of these, references, might have actually been, red herrings. They might have just been added in there to throw the scent off or to distract the investigators, sort of thing. And they actually did find 2 hairs in the remains of the explosion, if you can believe that they thought were from the killer because they didn't match the DNA of any of the family members. But they also didn't match the DNA of the boss or the ex-boss or of his son, and so the case remained as unsolved as ever. There were some sketches of these men drawn up, and these men were apparently seen going into a local post office and asking them and trying to find out the new address of the Greavette family. And they were kind of blown off, whatever. But later on during the investigation, they found this out. They had some sketches done of the men, but they didn't really match anyone they knew, didn't match any of the suspects, and so that evidence really didn't go anywhere. And so in the end, that's basically where the case ended. Wayne was dead, his family was grieving, and they still to this day have no idea who made the bomb or who sent the bomb or who, as a result, ended up killing Wayne. Whispers on Lake Yellowstone refers to these strange, ominous sounds or music sometimes. Sometimes it's been described as whispering or ghoul-like sounds.
Little green ghouls, buddy.
Or buzzing, bzzz, or strange hums coming from the sky or the water around Lake Yellowstone. And these were heard as far back as the late 1800s, when in particular a geologist named Frank H. Bradley was just out doing research, and he reported a curious sound between a whistle and a horse whine, which I'm not even going to attempt to replicate that. Okay, I did it anyway. But since then, there have been various noises that have been heard that range from, as I said, hums or buzzes, like a large swarm of bees or something. And I know what you're thinking. It's probably just bees, or the whistling is probably just the wind, but they would hear buzzing when there was no bees around whatsoever, and they would hear these strange whistling windy sounds on, completely calm days. But somewhat maybe more eerily, there was these strange kind of metal sounds, metal cables or chains clanking together, smashing together, or this creepy organ music, or ducks in flight, which I don't know what that sounds like, quack or something. But yeah, very creepy case, very strange, kind of traditional, eerie mystery, and one that perhaps we may never figure out. Bam! That is a blurry apple. And if you're enjoying the video, I will send a apple to every single person who subscribes, and maybe a pear if you like the video, and maybe a peach or a plum or something if you also hit the little bell icon. So help me on my journey to 100,000 subscribers and stay in the loop for whenever I upload a new video. The yogurt shop murders of Austin, Texas was an absolutely horrific, brutal, senseless killing, or rather set of killings, that was never solved, and we still to this day don't know who committed them. But this case takes us back to the 6th of December 1991, where at a yogurt shop called, and I kid you not, it was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, located in Austin, Texas. And this was, late at night. It was around 11 p.m., which was roughly the closing time for this shop. And the two girls who were working there had, already closed up for the night. And these were two 17-year-olds, Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas. And also in the shop that night were two other girls, 13-year-old Amy Ayers and Jennifer's 15-year-old sister, Sarah Harbison. And these two other girls were waiting for the two 17-year-old girls to, close up shop, to clean everything, to pack everything away, as they were all catching a ride with Jennifer to, go wherever they were each going, maybe to home, maybe to their neighborhood or something. And this was all at around, as I said, around 11 p.m. And then at around midnight, a patrolling policeman was, patrolling along. He saw this yogurt shop suddenly up in flames, and he went over there. He eventually called more people over to the scene. They ended up putting out the fire, but what they found inside the yogurt shop was absolutely horrific. All four girls were found inside, having been shot dead with two separate pistols in the back of the head, execution style, and were lying there dead, severely burnt, and naked and tied up and gagged with their own underwear. At least one of the girls had been raped. And the fire seems to have been an attempt to, disrupt the scene, destroy any evidence, any DNA evidence that they might have left at the scene. And at that, it was quite successful. Police weren't really able to get, any fingerprints, any hair. The only DNA they could find was from one of the assaulted girls. And I'm sure you can imagine what type of DNA that was. But from that sample, it was like a little inconclusive. They couldn't get the type of DNA or the type of sample where it narrowed it to one person, but rather it was just a wide range of people. So it was useful, I guess, for clearing victims, because if you didn't have that type of DNA, then it couldn't have been you. But as far as pinpointing it on someone, or even prosecuting someone even that shares the same type of DNA, if it's shared with also 100,000 people or 10,000 or a million or whatever, it's a little hard to prosecute that person in court. But they didn't really have any suspects anyway. But there were initially two guys who were very suspicious on that night. There was one that was in the yogurt shop a few hours before closing time, who was apparently being a bit of a nuisance. He was kind of causing a scene in the line, and he ended up going to the bathroom for quite a while. And so investigators maybe suspected that when he went back there, he ended up going to a back room, finding a door, propping open the door, or propping open a back window maybe. And so later on, when the shop closed, him and one of his accomplices were able to go around the back, sneak in, and do whatever they did to these girls. And this was further evidenced by another couple, an innocent, just normal couple, who were in and around the store at around closing time, or just before the store had closed. And when they left the store at sometime around 11 p.m., they said Jennifer closed the doors, locked the front doors, and they saw two men sitting outside on a table looking apparently very suspicious. And so the theory was that this guy had gone in, propped open a door or window. The two men waited outside until the girls had locked up shop, and then they went round back, snuck in, attacked the girls, and set fire to the yogurt shop. But that all seems to be kind of besides the point. The people that the investigators originally investigated was in particular one 15-year-old named Forrest Welburn, who was found at the time not on the night of the murder, but a few days afterwards. He was found with a .22 caliber pistol in his possession, which notably was the same type of pistol that was used in these attacks, and he was found kind of causing a little bit of trouble at a nearby mall. So they picked him up, asked him, what the hell he was doing, where he got the gun from, if he'd used the gun at all, and this turned into an entire fustercluck, shall we say, of different informations, confessions, false convictions, just all sorts. Where initially, during the first investigation, they found Forrest, he had a gun in his possession, the police picked him up, took the gun from him, and then started to question him about these yogurt shop murders. And apparently he implicated and threw under the bus 3 of his friends. And so at the time the police thought, alright, this is an open and shut case. It was clearly this kid and his friends. He seems to have implicated them. He seems to have admitted to the killings. But it was later decided that this information was a tiny bit forced, from the investigators. And it was a little bit, shaky. And they thought that he might just be doing this in order to get off his, gun charge. So maybe they said to him, look, you're going to go to prison for having this gun. If you maybe tell us what we want to hear, perhaps that gun charge goes away. And so that was the kind of idea for the initial investigation. And so they ended up just kind of dismissing them as potential suspects. They didn't prosecute any of them, and the case was kind of temporarily closed. And these kids, just for reference, they were kind of kids, kind of young adults. They were 17-year-old Robert Springsteen, also 17-year-old Michael Scott, 16-year-old Maurice Pierce, and of course 15-year-old Forrest Welburn. So police, as I said, kind of released all of these young men. They charged them with some minor crimes, and they thought in general they were like, wrong'un kids. They were like petty criminals, did a bit of maybe light shoplifting, maybe carrying a gun or a knife but never using it. They didn't think, at least in the initial investigation, that they were guilty or even capable of a quadruple homicide. But fast forward to many years later, there was a new detective assigned to look into this case, and he was basically like, bro, these kids are like prime suspects. Like, they absolutely could have done these murders. They somewhat confessed to them. They implicated each other. Like, we should not have let them go. So during this second investigation, they brought these boys back in for more questioning. And here, I'll just point out, is a very key piece of this entire case. But the original 1991 investigations, these interrogations with these boys, basically had no record. So nothing was videotaped, in terms of the interviews. Also, nothing was written down. No real notes were made about what was said to the boys, what the boys said, which will be important in just a little bit. But basically, during this second investigation, as they were interviewing these boys, apparently the boys started to kind of implicate themselves. As in, they would give information about the killers, about the victims, about the case and the crime scene, etc., that only either the police or the killers themselves would actually know. And so this was used as evidence that clearly the boys knew more than they should have known, and this could only be possible if they were actually there that night and they had killed these 4 girls. Except, as I said, none of the initial investigation and interviews, none of that was recorded, and so we can't really know for sure exactly what was told to the boys in the initial investigation. So for instance, if the police had said in the initial interviews, during the interview they said, look, these 4 girls were killed in this specific way using 2 specific guns, and then the boys remembered this in their head. So then during the later investigation, maybe one of the boys said, it was 2 guns and I've only got 1 gun, or I couldn't have killed them in that way because of so and so reason. And then the police were like, ha, Nobody else knows exactly how they were killed, so therefore you must have been there. Or the boys did know how these girls were killed because they were the killers, but the point is we are not entirely sure exactly what they were told in the initial investigation. And so years later, after being, interrogated, after being interviewed and questioned, after doing some jail time, eventually these boys kind of incriminated one another. They were threatened with massive amounts of jail time and prison time, and so they had to testify against one another. And so in the end, 2 of these boys were basically convicted of these murders, and they were charged with quadruple homicide, and one was sentenced to death with the other being sentenced to life. But for many, many reasons, which we will get into in just a little bit, eventually these cases and these convictions were thrown out. And the first reason was that there was no actual physical evidence used to convict these boys, or they were technically young men at the time they were convicted, I guess. But all of the prosecution and all of their evidence basically involved, describing the case, telling the jury how horrific this was, how violent and aggressive, killed these 4 innocent girls just out of nowhere, just describing the brutality of the case, which for sure is like mostly circumstantial evidence. And they also used testimony from each of the boys in order to prosecute the other. And so the cases were both overturned due to something called the confrontation clause in the 6th Amendment, which I'll explain it quickly here, but the confrontation clause basically says that whoever is accusing you of something, you have a legal right to, confront your accuser. And that is basically put in place to stop general hearsay. So say you have a murder case, you have a witness who says, yeah, I saw him, I can identify him. They can't use that testimony in court unless they actually bring that person in, put them on the stand, and that is so the accused and his defense, lawyers, etc., can cross-reference this person, they can ask them questions while they're on the stand, and they can also question, the validity of this person, see if they're a general liar, maybe they're unreliable in their memories or in their recognition. And so that is the legal standard which is normally kept to, as most cases that don't adhere to this are thrown out. But in this case, it was kind of weird because they were using the testimony of one of the other boys, and this other boy was also one of the ones who was sentenced for these murders. So they basically, during the investigation of one of the boys, they used testimony from another boy, and this boy was also charged for the murders, and he was never brought to the stand in the other boy's case. So that all amounted to one of the convicted boys being legally, technically unable to face his accuser in court, and so the conviction of both of them was thrown out. And I feel like I've transformed into Legal Eagle or something. And so when these cases were thrown out, when these convictions were reversed, this was in 2009, and it was only then that the police came forward and said, actually, the DNA that we did find at the crime scene, the only DNA, it doesn't match the DNA of any of these 4 accused, which you'd think would be something that they would bring up, during the trial. And in fact, people of the jury who originally convicted the boys said that they wouldn't have convicted them if they knew about this DNA evidence. And on top of all that, during the initial investigation, one of the key detectives involved was a man named Hector Polanco, who had been at another time accused of prying false confessions out of people. And the most notable example or case of this were Christopher Ochoa and Richard Danziger, who were both falsely accused of killing Nancy DePriest, and both confessions were apparently drawn out of them, either through coercion or threats, etc., and they were both sentenced originally to life in prison, but ended up only serving, only 13 years, which is incredibly short for a murder if you are guilty, but seems like most of your life if you're an innocent person. And so, yeah, it's a crazy case. You have the two men who were seen outside who might very well have been the actual people who murdered these 4 girls, but they were seen by a few people and then never again identified afterwards. And then you have these 4 teenagers who were mostly wrong-uns. You know, they weren't well-behaved or nice lads, but it seems like perhaps they were, you know, run through the justice system and more or less interrogated, had false testimonies drawn out of them. There was evidence that the police withheld during the trial, and the trial itself broke one of the, you know, constitutional amendments. But after all of that, we are, you know, left with no case. We can't identify these 2 men. The 4 boys originally, who are men now, have not, you know, currently been charged with any of these murders. And so the case, as well as the justice surrounding these 4 girls killed in one of the most horrific, brutal ways that I've ever seen, and for almost no reason. You know, it seems like whoever did this just went in there, killed the girls, and then burnt down the shop. Like, it's just insanely tragic, sad, and senseless. But as I said, this case still remains unsolved to this day. And just a quick aside for this case, the police over the years have apparently admitted that at least 50 people have confessed to these murders, which is just absolutely insane to me. Like, why would anybody do this? Like, street cred or something? Mental illness? Confusion? I don't know. But as always, let me know your thoughts down below. And that is all we have time for. As a reminder, guys, if you want to support the channel and you haven't checked out any of these cool mugs, caps, t-shirts, hoodies, mouse mats, all with original official designs done by a real-life human artist with no AI in it whatsoever, then check out the link in the description and probably the pinned comment linking to Connor's Curiosities merch shop. And as a reminder, the next 6 people who order will also receive a handwritten letter from yours truly. So as always, I will see you in the next video. There is 1 video left, I believe, in this tier, which has been a long tier if I'm honest, but after this one more left, then that will complete tier 8, and then we will move on to some more unique icebergs, maybe cover 1 or 2 cases on their own. But to make sure you don't miss any of that, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon, and as always, thanks for watching.